welcome to this panel.
Yes.
Grace's Seen and Unseen, Catholic Imagination and Contemporary Literary Studies. I'm excited to be on this panel. We have three excellent speakers, including our man of the hour, Paul Mariani, and he is going to read a little bit from his new collection, which is Ordinary Time, just came out, and then also from The Mystery of It All, The Vocation of Poetry in the Twilight of Modernity. And Dana Greene is going to talk to us about her experience as a biographer, particularly, and I'm very interested in this, the intersect of the genre as a incarnational sacramental space. And she's going to be talking about Elizabeth Jennings, who is not known enough, and part of her mission is to make her more known, and also coming out of her other work on Denise Levertov. And then we have Kevin Burke, SJ, who will be speaking further on Denise Levertov with his contributions to a collection and another piece that he's working on. So I will let them carry on. Thank you. You can, or you can stay seated. Is the other mic still working if he wants to?
Thank you. That's all right. Yes, that's useful. Okay. Just to make sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, you can hear me? It's not turned on. Okay. Yes, it is.
Just talk. Be sure to talk really
Bum, 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 bum. You hear that?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Here we go. Okay. All right. Thank you for coming. My name is Paul Mariani. I have two new books that just came out in the last 2 months. In fact, Greg Wolf just gave me the first copy of Ordinary Time just when we got here to Chicago. I want to just read a little bit from the opening here of the mystery of it all, the vocation of poetry in the twilight of modernity. And I've been writing poetry for 40 years. I was a teacher for 56 years. I've been writing essays all that time. I'm a biographer. I've done 6 biographies. The most recent was on Wallace Stevens. Before that was Hopkins. But I thought I would just read the opening here, the introduction, the vocation of the Catholic poet today. Boston College. I'm sitting in on a meeting of our English department, the senior faculty, 20 of us, and we're going over some of the future directions our department will be taking. The discussion ebbs and flows and ebbs, some speaking more pointedly and eloquently than others about the merits of this and that, of transnationalism, film studies, American studies, cultural studies, the effects of East-West connections and hybridizations in popular films coming out of Hollywood and Bollywood. And for a moment, attention shifts to films portraying Victorian characters in minor classics, and I realize I have never read and probably never will. Someone mentions Indian versions of African hip-hop. Another speaks of 18th century wax dolls and effigies of dead children done in beeswax and dressed in crinoline. Of the long tradition of what she refers to as Catholic idolatry figured in statues of Mary and a panoply of saints. And I drift back now to other such meetings, 40 years of them, at places like Colgate and Hunter and John Jay College, and especially the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where I taught for 32 years. And the hot topics evoked there and then over the years were the canon and the new canon and the anti-canon and the new feminism and African-American studies and Native American studies and Irish studies and Holocaust studies and Nuyorican studies and structuralism and post-structuralism and the Gothic and the Neo-Gothic and folklore studies and the literature of of the various new diasporas coming out of South America and Korea and Japan and India, China, and the Philippines, each and every one proposed with a burning zeal as the next wave of concern and interest, only the faces of the proponents shifting or aging or disappearing with the passage of the years. And so it has gone on. In the great going round of all things, all voices worthy to be heard, paid attention to, heeded. But for me, raised in the great tradition of Catholic and Reformation thought in the classics, Hellenism and Hebraism combined and expanded, something central, something on which to hang everything else, seems missing. And suddenly it occurs to me again what that bracing presence Flannery O'Connor once said, that you have to push as hard as the age that pushes against you. She was speaking of the inherent skepticism of the Catholic scholar of one candle, small as that light may appear to be, facing this new idea, and that interminably per secula et secularum, world without end, then is now, now is then. Okay, so that brings me to some poems. And what I've tried to do, particularly, well, for years really, but I think in a particular way in this new volume called Ordinary Time, is to speak to that Dantesque vision, hell, which we all know, purgatory, which we're going through, and then those glimpses, those transcendent and imminent glimpses of the Paradiso. And so I thought I would read you two poems. One that's more hellish and one that strives like Fra Angelico, and that beautiful image of young angel, all women, by the way, as they enter into heaven. And so here we go. The first one is called In the Realm of Kings and Queens. Just a word, this is New York City. Kings is the old name for Brooklyn, okay, and then Queens, okay. And this goes back, it's also men and women, kings and queens. And it goes back to my youth 70 years ago. This is the way it goes. 70 years on, and the scene still screams. We've just crossed over the 59th Street Bridge, only to descend into the shrieking Malibos they call Long Island City. It's 1947, and we're bumping along under the winged, cross-hatched, humping shadows above the spittle gray cobblestones, past the grim brick factories as if underwater. The glint of trolley rails, Fords and Chevys moaning and yawing this way, then that. The stuttering grind of oil and coal trucks bustling in from everywhere. My mother, she's still in her early 20s, stares straight ahead, trying hard as even I can see to concentrate on driving through this nightmare. My brother Walter, feet dangling, sits here in the back seat, tense across from me. And little Emily, burbling, is saddled to the seat between. I stare out the left rear window at the blare of traffic. No radio, just the roar of angry horns, when suddenly, like that, from out of nowhere, a monster cement truck comes slicing over. No warning, just the exposed nuts of that gargantuan wheel, chewing up the left front door and fender of our pre-war Ford, like some demon out of hell. Of course, she has no choice now but to pull over to the crumbling curbside. As the sullen truck pulls over too, and then the cab door opens and the driver is yelling at my mother, demanding to know where she ever learned to fucking drive. And no, he ain't taking no blame, lady, for none of this shit. You understand? You understand? And there's my mother, trembling, for the safety of her kids, saying something at the looming man, trying to reason where there's no room for reason because there's no cop anywhere to be seen. And then he's off and gone, and we're heading home to greet our father, who, when he sees the damage done, makes it clear he's pissed. And there's the lesson, son, you've learned, that it's a man's world. You understand? It's men who make the rules by which we're bound and by which the world turns, a wheel roaring up on you as it just goes grinding round and round and round. And then the second one, more positive. It would have to be. But it also picks up on the theme of the wheel, the great wheel of going round. They too go round. In Williams's Pictures from Bruegel, they go round and around, those peasants pounding the ground with their clogs and their boots to the sound of the fiddles and sackbuts. True, nothing profound there. Just a rollicking midsummer dance with a stout-rumped male and female, those suds' sodden faces caught in a moment both comic and sad. But haven't we all thought of ourselves, our own lives circling round and about in time's turning, a tuning, a turning, left hand and right reaching out in a wheel like the spheres in their own solemn round dance, pivoting round like wheels circling some invisible maypole, at its center, a ring dance of the blessed. The way Fra Angelico reveals in his judgment, that angelic choir gazing as if into your soul, as others gaze upward. The radiant glow of that sea-changing moment, now and forever, hoi, hoi, ho. Remember the wheel at the Tuileries those long years ago? The fear as you stared down into the dark? Or your steering wheel locking as if gripped by some angel, that car heading for you before it somehow veered off? The sheer terror of that, then the awe and relief. Or the truck pounding its way into your poor mother's car, the sick sound as it shredded the door. Oh God, the round of the days, each bound for oblivion, the hours and minutes going round and around, reminding us daily of what must come in the end. Timor mortis conturbat me, sings the old song, replaying the fear that winds and unwinds. Ah, but look, as upward they gaze, those blessed dancing round and around in that circle of praise. Thank you.
I'm going to try this. Will this work if I take this over here? I want to see everybody. Thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be. It's a great pleasure to be. Can you hear me now? Great pleasure to be here with these fellow panelists, Paul and Kevin. I've got 16 minutes. That's what they said we could have, and I'd like, and that's. I want to do two things, maybe even three things. I want to tell you a little bit about Elizabeth Jennings, a poet that Dana Gioia claims is England's finest modern Catholic poet, one whose work returned the Catholic perspective to the mainstream of British verse. Since most Americans have never heard of Elizabeth Jennings, I'll say a bit about her life and her enormous corpus, some 48 books, over 1,000 published poems, and some 30,000 unpublished poems, which I made my way through. I also want to spend some minutes on how her poetry reflects the Catholic imagination. But I want to save a few precious moments at the end to speak about how biography as a genre might nurture a sacramental and incarnational perspective. In the Q&A, I can also talk a little bit about Denise Levertov. So first, Elizabeth Jennings. She died in 2001, so she is really one of our contemporaries. She grew up in Oxford and spent most of her life there. She was the daughter of a medical doctor and was raised as a cradle Catholic. Her childhood was mostly miserable. She was often sickly and felt as if she were odd and clumsy. After primary education in Catholic schools, which she hated, she attended Oxford Girls High School and ultimately St. Anne's College. She began to write poetry early on, and this gave her some solace. While at university, she met other poets, and her poems began to be published. After college, her father secured her a position in the Oxford City Library, and there she continued to interact with other Oxford poets. In 1957, and this was a very important event, she won the Somerset Maugham Award and went to Rome for 3 months. This was a life-changing moment for her. She claimed that in Rome, her faith was restored and renewed. Returning to England, she decided to give up her library position and attempt to support herself as a writer, a very risky business. During the 1950s, she became allied with a group of poets called the Movement, which included the likes of Philip Larkin, Kingsley Amis, Robert Conquest, and others. She was set apart from this group, however, as the only woman and the only Catholic. She was sui generis. She saw herself linked to the metaphysical poets of the past, especially Traherne and Hubert, and also with Hopkins, whom she admired most of all. She began to turn out book after book of poetry, prose, and reviews, barely keeping body and soul together. Overworked and lonely, she became more psychologically unstable. And in the early 1960s, she made 3 suicide attempts, which led her to be institutionalized for a year and a half. Although she wrote about these experiences, her poetry was never confessional or self-pitying. For her, poetry purpose was communion and communication. Her poems sold well, and she won a number of important prizes, ultimately being honored as commander of the British Empire and being included in the secondary school A-levels curriculum. But her life was difficult. She was ill, lonely, and emotionally very needy. She never married, and she had few friends. She was constantly in financial extremis. At one point, she was homeless or frequently moving from one bedsit to another. Yet against extraordinary odds, she persevered in her vocation as a poet. On the one hand, she was hailed as the best of the movement poets, the most unconditionally loved writer of her generation, and a triumph of integrity. But other critics were merciless, and she was described as prissily decorous, a writer who turned out acres of meaningless pieties, the bag lady of the sonnets, a ramshackle poet. The criticism hurt her profoundly. What saved her? Jennings answered this query herself. She claimed that it was her religion and her poetry, the latter deriving from the former. She wrote, "Poetry is an art that's close to all religion. Poetry is my way of reaching God." Jennings had a firm grasp on the central Christian belief in the incarnation. Of her experience in Rome, she wrote, "Here, quote, flesh and spirit seemed at one, and I was learning gradually the deep love and wisdom of my faith for the first time. In Rome, faith was made easy. All the doubts I'd known vanished there. Belief rose up in stone and marble." In Rome, she wrote, an unhappy childhood was handed back and altered. She claimed that unlike in England, where Catholics were a minority set apart, in Italy she felt whole and free as both an artist and a Catholic. Her views on poetry and her vocation as a poet are steeped in religious metaphor. She wrote that poets are makers, and hence, quote, "Poets do in little what God does with all his force. God is present in all poetry that's made with form and purpose." Jennings believed that we live in a, quote, "wild world of misrule, of chaos, decay, and darkness, but we are haunted by a strange homesickness for the Edenic world which has been lost." Poetry was the means to return to that world. It discovered order mid chaos, meaning in the midst of confusion, affirmation in the heart of despair. In the large flights of imagination, she wrote, "I see for one crammed second order so explicitly that I need no more persuasion." As such, poetry was for her a kind of secular sacrament, which helped reclaim and restore what was lost, but half remembered. She analogized the poet to the priest, both through words transformed and brought one to a lost and forgotten world. She wrote that poetry was an outward drive towards truth and mystery and a way of being. She was clear and unequivocal. Poetry saved her. It was her raison d'etre. Jennings' reflections on the nature of poetry and its meaning are scattered, unsystematic, descriptive, and discursive. Nonetheless, she offers a unique understanding of poetry as evidence of the lived experience of faith. As such, she has made a contribution, I think, to theopoetics, that theological examination of various alternatives, expressions of faith. Jennings states unequivocally that religion and poetry were the most important things in her life. As a maker, the poet participates in God's work of creation, and the poem becomes a meeting place between the human and the divine. She analogizes the poem to dervish dancing, which strips away the veil and let God step out of his inventions. She claims that liturgical life offers diffused theology, and so too my poetry. The two phenomena of religion and poetry are inextricably linked. She considered faith a way of looking, of seeing, and understanding the world as incarnation. God was within reality, accessible, especially in nature and human love, and documented by poetry and the arts. Creative imagination, which was central to the poet, produced metaphor, simile, images, these suggested alternative ways to conceptualize religious understanding and hence to ease religious doubt. In her poem, Harvest and Consecration, she writes, "I thought of the priest as midwife and as mother, feeling the pain, feeling the pleasure too, all opposites together until you, and she's referring to David Jones here, until you said no one could feel such passion and still preserve the power of consecration. And it is true, the seed, the simple thing must die, if only to restore our faith in fruitful hidden things. I see the wine and the bread protect our ecstasy. And in a full moon, and I think of this every time I see a full moon, she writes, tonight the full moon is the host held up for everyone's eyes to see and understand the deep and high salvation in the skies. And in Assurance Beyond Midnight, one of her last poems, she writes, but I know well, and now my spirit wakes and is assured, imagination is rich. Helped out of sickness and heartbreak, I feel in touch with everything that's peace, and later on there will arrive with dawn a bold assurance and a synthesis of what awaits for me not much further on, but near enough to tell me faith is bold and proves itself in all that has been done to me and for me in the golden world. Jennings understood that poetry's powers were various. She made some very big claims for poetry. She wrote that poetry could heal the lonely and lost, haunt the reader, and speak across continents. It was a gift of kindness and a help in grappling with fear. It brought contrition, fostered justice. It was an arc of good. Finally, she suggests that poetry was sacramental. Perhaps, she wrote, there is something like a sacrament about this process, this way of words, this gift. To some, Jennings' attempts to access transcendent reality by means of poetry may seem anachronistic. It represents a longing for a timeless, mythic past. And yet one wonders if she's not onto something fundamental, that what she names as our long desire. Certainly her popularity as a poet speaks to the pervasiveness of a hope for some guiding vision of wholeness and freedom, so absent in her world and in ours. Jennings must be credited not only with linking back to a sacramental and incarnational tradition in English poetry and extending it into her own time, but for acknowledging a way forward when belief is fraught and no vision is evident. I'm reminded of Wallace Stevens, one of Jennings' favorite poets, who claimed that after one has abandoned a belief in God, poetry is the essence which takes its place as life's redemption. May be a great tool in our times. It might be that in a post-religious age, poetry might serve in part as a stand-in for religion, one which points to some truth and some mystery. My query now is this: is it possible for biography, which is what I do, I'm not a poet, that humanistic study of the person to include a sacramental, incarnational perspective, and as such, point towards mystery as well? If the Christian posits the act of creation, that the act of creation means that the divine inhabits the human, both as its source and its end, should not that element be captured somehow in at least some biographies? Admittedly, not all lives offer fertile ground for this exploration. The exception, I think, being that of artists, particularly poets, whose inner lives are made so accessible in their work. This query of mine, can biography point to the numinous in each life? This query immediately presents problems. We must remember there was a hard fought and won separation of biography from a secular genre from hagiography, the purpose of which was to give glory to God. Biography's intent at its best gathers the shards of a life with an objection neither to adulate nor condemn, but to understand the whole person in all of her contributions, brokenness, failures, contradictions, and limitations. As such, biography is a humanistic narrative, totally independent from hagiography. It's based on hard-won evidence, like reading 30,000 of her poems. Evidence like historical, literary, psychological, medical evidence. Admittedly, the biographer is an interpreter, but an interpreter under oath, unlike fiction writers, people who write memoirs, autobiographies. A biographer is an interpreter under oath. One cannot make up the facts, invent dialogue, or offer supernatural causation or explanation, even if one's subject advances that explanation. In what sense, then, can biography hope to penetrate through the external to the inner consciousness, to capture the ineffable, the numinous in a subject's life? How does one speak of this reality without using religious language? Although Keats poetically described life as a veil of soul-making, Virginia Woolf, herself a biographer, allowed that one can't write directly about the soul. Looked at, she said, it vanishes. I've often thought of the work of the biographer as a kind of pointing to the mysterious center of a person's being. By marshaling and organizing vast amounts of luminous particulars, especially about vocation, longing, suffering, awe, wonder, death, and love, the biographer closes in on her subject, hoping at this threshold to catch flashes of her subject's central intent and desire. Then it's gone. But in this process, there are lingering glints of encounter which endure, and it is in them that understanding is grounded. This understanding remains shrouded in mystery, but it is the treasure at the center of a life. It sounds too grandiose to call this a contemplative methodology, but both in the intent of the biographer to penetrate to the core of the person and to include the legitimate gropings of one's subject toward the place of encounter of the self and the ineffable, this way of pursuing or proceeding does share characteristics with contemplation. For the reader, this kind of biographical narrative can offer inspiration, affirming as it does the ongoing glints of the numinous embodied in every human life. As such, biography expands our understanding not so much of the divine, but of the human as embodied sacrament. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you, Paul and Dana. It's interesting to me, Paul, your image of the wheel is one that I'm going to find myself kind of circling around, although we didn't intend that. I was aware that Dana, who has written a biography of Denise Levertov, and I feel like sometimes I'm the goose at the back of the skein that gets to draft on the ones up in front who kind of cut the air. I'm a theologian, and so my interest is a theological interest of really trying to read, not in the biography is important, it's crucial to understanding someone like Denise Levertov, but I also want to read her as a theologian, not only as a poet. So I was privileged to speak at a conference here at Loyola 4 years ago that burst into this book yesterday. I mean, this is the first one. They flew it in from Whip and Stock. So that to be here at the conference, it's called This Need to Dance, This Need to Kneel. And a number of different commentators reflecting on the kind of the theological side of Denise's poetry, Denise Levertov and the Poetics of Faith. I'd like to kind of be between that book and another that I've been working on for several years that views Denise's life and her poetry as a genre of theology. And so today I want to say a few words about her life and poetic vocation under the rubric of what we might call the dance of life. A couple of quick words about her own biography. Denise was born in England in 1923 to a brilliant, artistic Welsh mother who herself had been an orphan. Equally brilliant, scholarly Russian father, a Hasidic Jew who found the Messiah when he read the Gospel of Matthew and became a Christian, much to his family's chagrin. He too, an orphan in a sense. He eventually became an Anglican priest and a scholar of great Jewish mystical texts and someone whose life work was to bring Christians and Jews together and to help them see that they belong to one another. Denise was married shortly after the Second World War to an American writer. She immigrated to the U.S. She relearned the English language in an American idiom. One of her great mentors was none other than William Carlos Williams. And there were crucial interruptions and turning points in her life, obviously the Second World War and coming to the U.S., but also becoming a politically engaged activist during the terrifying tempest of Vietnam. And then returning after years of living, of understanding herself as basically an agnostic. She returned to the practice of Christian faith. And in the last decade of her life before her death in 1997, she entered the Catholic Church in a Jesuit parish in Seattle. Very understated kind of quote unquote conversion. But let me simply note that whatever her Catholic imagination, however we would understand that, her Catholic imagination is also a Jewish imagination. It's also Protestant and Anglican. It's English. It's secular. It's a lot of things. Her eclectic education, with its emphasis on reading, language, precocious introduction to the arts, included an early immersion in dance. She began dancing classes at the age of 3. And her first recital, she was 4. When she was 7, she and her 9-year-old neighbor, Margaret Courtwell, began to explore together what she later referred to as private dancings, plural. In her volume Tesserae, Memories and Suppositions, published in 1996, most of the little stories in here, most of the little mosaic tiles are from her early childhood. She writes this: both of us have taken lessons down the street in Miss Lawrence's classes, ballet, Greek, acrobatic, tap, but these private dancings secretly draw on any of that unless perhaps a little of the relative freedom of Greek. What we do, though it's years before I find a word for it, is a spontaneous eurythmy. Her exposure to dance at an early age was not incidental, and its presence within the serious business of childhood play was shaping Denise at 7 in ways she was still discovering and naming at the dawn of her 7th decade. By speaking in the present tense of those cherished moments with Margaret, she allows us, her later readers, to feel something of their intimacy and their raw power. She writes, "We don't talk much. We never criticize each other's performance. We lend, as each takes her turn at the piano bench, grave assent to the leaps and whirls we watch, the flailing of arms in storm, the outstretched imploring hands, the solemn pacing in unspecified situations of delay and decision, or the twittering feet of surprise and delight as the music hops into cheerful briskness. We never laugh at one another. We don't verbalize our responses to the music, so I never learn what Margaret has in mind. But I know that what happens for me is a drama of unspecified loss, discovery, flight, Sehnsucht, ecstatic joy, danger. No definite story, no named person, no clear dilemmas, but the sweeping passage of grand emotions." End quote. Well, she never stopped dancing. The drama of unspecified loss, discovery, flight, Sehnsucht. In a poem written in the late 50s, published in one of her early books after coming to the U.S., an elegy for her father, who died in 1954, she writes, "I dance for joy, only for joy, while you lie dying, into whose eyes I looked seldom enough, all the years seldom with candid love. Let my dance be mourning then, now that I love you too late." In Dance Memories, written a decade later, she returns to this image of the dance for joy that is also lamentation. The joy of leaping, of moving by leaps and bounds, of gliding to leap, and gliding to leap becomes, while it lasts, heart-pounding, breath hurting, the deepest, the only joy. In a magnificent poem, published at the same time and entitled "A Tree Telling of Orpheus," Denise draws on various versions of the original myth regarding the fate of that hero of music and poetry. In her telling, it is the trees who remember, the trees who tell the story of Orpheus and who remember that he changed them forever. They remember that his music taught them to dance. And in the stillness of the abiding dance of trees, the music continues to play. And the poem, it's a long poem, it ends with these lines. "Perhaps he will not return, but what we have lived comes back to us. We see more. We feel as our rings increase, something that lifts our branches, that stretches our furthest leaf tips further. The wind, the birds do not sound poorer but clearer, recalling our agony and the way we danced. The music." So I turn now to a late religious poem after her kind of return to the explicit practice of Christian faith in her 50s. It's the poem from which I borrow what at least serves me right now as the working title for the book I'm currently wanting to write on her poetic theology. I want to call it "Into the Ring of the Dance." In his remarkable ecclesiastical history of the English people, the Venerable Bede tells of a gentle 7th century monk named Caedmon, a humble brother with no gift for eloquence or music. He would leave the table when the singing and the tales began and make his way back to the stable where he had charge of the cattle, until a fateful night when, and this is Bede's word, quote, "there appeared to him in his sleep one who said, greeting him by name, 'Sing, Caedmon, some songs for me.' 'I cannot sing,' he answered, 'for this cause I left the feast and came hither.' He who talked with him answered, 'However that be, you shall sing to me.' 'What shall I sing?' rejoined Caedmon. 'The beginning of created things. What Bede tells next is the earliest recorded poem written in the English language. The story of Caedmon was well known to Denise Levertov. She read it as a child, as she says in John Richard Greene's History of the English People. Many years later, in the aftermath of her slow awakening to the practice of Christian faith, Levertov composed a beautiful rendering of Bede's story. She calls it simply Caedmon, but her poem does more than simply retell the story. Although it gives no direct evidence of being autobiographical in the usual sense of the word, her use of the first person to bring Caedmon close allows us to hear him telling the story of his religious encounter and to feel the genuine humility of his self-description. And at the same time, it allows him to speak in an undertone, as it were, for her, for the deepening of her poetic vocation. Here's the poem in its entirety. All others talked as if talk were a dance. Clodhopper I, with clumsy feet, would break the gliding ring. Early I learned to hunch myself close by the door. And then when the talk began, I'd wipe my mouth and wind unnoticed back to the barn to be with the warm beasts, dumb among the body sounds of the simple ones. I'd see by a twist of lit rush the motes of gold moving from shadow to shadow, slow in the wake of deep untroubled sighs. The cows munched or stirred or were still. I was at home and lonely, both in good measure, until the sudden angel affrighted me. Light effacing my feeble beam, a forest of torches, feathers of flame, sparks up flying. But the cows, as before, were calm, and nothing was burning. Nothing but I, as that hand of fire touched my lips and scorched my tongue and pulled my voice into the ring of the dance. Isn't that great? I just love this poem. With such economy, she places the capacity for expression at the heart of Caedmon's story, introducing the grace of elocution through the simile of dance. All others talked as if talk were a dance. However, the dance imagery contains a further noteworthy valence. If speech not only as dynamic and dramatic, but also as embodied and social. It takes a hearer. The individual body implies the social body, just as the community incorporates the person. In one telling phrase, we glimpse the graceful dancer and the sociable ring of dancers. The dance is complete when it creates the ring, and each dancer belongs to what she or he helps to configure. Her use of dance images to frame her exploration of Bede's story gives further evidence that the story of Caedmon touched something elemental in her own journey. More precisely, the unique inflection points that she imparts to the Caedmon tradition reflect a new moment in her lifelong exploration of the poet's vocation. Levertov discovered her special gift for poetry early in life. She spoke at the age of 10 of having a poetic destiny. She was precocious. But it seems she only discovered herself drawn into the ring of the dance in successive later moments, including the agonizing crisis provoked by the U.S. involvement in Vietnam and the very different kind of crisis that accompanied her reawakening to faith, to the practice of religious faith. Poetic integrity and social political authenticity unfolded in her life as a discourse with and in the presence of the divine, however differently she imagined the divine in the different stages of her journey. So there's much more to say, but let me end by quoting one last late poem, just a part of it. It's called Dom Helder Camera at the Nuclear Test Site. Do you remember Dom Helder? That great Brazilian bishop. So this is an actual event she participated in. A number of the people got arrested. She talks about that. She talks about the mass and then the arrests. And then she ends with these lines. We form two circles, one contained in the other, to dance clockwise and counterclockwise like the children in Duncan's vision, but not to the song of ashes, of falling. We dance in the unity that brought us here. Instinct pulls us into the ancient rotation, symbol of continence, continuance, light and persistence as a tumbleweed, but not adrift. Dom held her too, faithful pilgrim, dances at the turning core. So part of the poet's vocation, it seems, is to invite us all into the ring of the dance. Thank you.
I thought you were going to have us all stand and dance.
So, any thoughts or questions of your own? You have a mic, folks.
I hate to speak after that. Will anybody hear? No, I just wanted to make two comments. And I was thinking about this when Dana was speaking. I have not heard one word about one name whose influence, at least for me, hovers over this conference. And it's Jacques Maritain. Now, we know that Flannery O'Connor was indebted to art and scholasticism. I thought it came out in my time. I think it was written in the 20s, at least as an essay. But also, listening to you, the creative intuition in art and poetry. I know for Robert Fitzgerald, who was involved in those seminars that took place when he wrote the book at Princeton. But he hovers the distinction, the important distinction, not so much for Flannery, between making and doing, and getting rid of the intrusion of moralism that was endemic to Catholicism in the early days, and to make that distinction, and how liberating it was for her. And then Maritain's appreciation of all his music and all his art, literary and artistic friends, so that when he talked about poetry and its sources and the deep in the preconscious life of the intellect and all of that, it was with real models, writings by people he knew and was in dialogue with. So I think of that. And then for you, I wanted to mention, Kevin, you've got to do Matisse and put that on the cover. Matisse's Dancers.
Thank you.
I want to ask the Dana Greene a question about Jennings. If you look at the modern British Catholic tradition of writing, which is this glorious, tradition of both novel and poetry, they're all converts, except for Jennings. And what do you think that makes distinctive about her work, and versus surrounded by basically Anglicans or atheists who became Catholic?
There's my cell phone going off in the background, but I'll just ignore that. Thank you, Dana. And I quoted you, Dana, before you came in, so your words preceded you. I think it made a difference for her that she was a cradle Catholic. In fact, she has two poems, actually, entitled Cradled Catholic. It was very different from being a convert, which I think was much more intellectual for her. She just grew up with this. And there was a kind of Jansenistic element in growing up as a English Catholic. And I think it contributed in some ways to her depression, which she had. It wasn't, as I said, it wasn't as the convert converts intellectually. It was aesthetic to be a Catholic, and it was what she was. You know, just the point that I was trying to make about going to Italy, she felt so liberated in Italy because it was a Catholic culture. And she didn't feel that in England. To be a cradle Catholic was to be very weird. And she bore the burden of that.
So a couple thoughts and a question. So Ken, your mentioning of Jacques Maritain, I think is very good. I do wish we'd had some a panel discussion. Just in case you weren't aware of it, Franciscan University Press published Samuel Hazo's doctoral dissertation on Maritain a couple of years ago, and I did a 10,000 word introduction to it that, for you Notre Dame fans, goes through Neo-Thomism at Notre Dame and actually gives a good account of, or a pretty thorough account of all of Maritain's writings on art and poetry. I was going to mention Maritain in any case, actually, because one of the things that excited me about your paper, Dr. Burke, was so much of the discipline of religion and literature has, as it originally emerged, was really for people who kind of felt religious-ish, but didn't want to think about positive theology or systematic theology. But that seems as if it's sort of a disservice to literature. It's rewarding and wonderful to see literature being taken seriously as capable of throwing light on being and on theology, the way that you showed that Levertov does. But my question is for our two biographers, which is, Paul, your biographies are so restrained, and in terms of how much you critically interpret the poetry, you try to be you use a very gentle hand in your biographies. And Dayton, I've only been reading the reviews of your biography. I can't wait to read it, though, because I just absolutely love Jennings. I'm just wondering if you both would mind responding, where do you see the role of the literary biography in the interpretation of the poet's work?
He's kindly let me go first. That's so we can think a little bit.
There we go.
The microphone. Yeah, I think biography is absolutely essential to ensure the future of a person's work. But I also think that it is context, and we all operate within context. And so if you have criticism without that biographical element, I think it's diminished. I mean, a life is important because of the work, but it is the life that makes the work possible. So to not have that element there is to have a diminished understanding, I think, of the subject.
Can you hear? Yes. Each of my 6 biographies, that's been a central question, really. What is the spiritual dimension? What is the movement towards something larger than the self? Where is this going? And it started with Williams, and you have the language, but you find, when I think of Williams, and I spent 10 years in that biography, I think here's a Franciscan, really, essentially, and he evokes St. Francis in his poetry all the way from the teens up through the 50s when he's suffering from a severe stroke. It comes back because that was his life as well. That is, he was a doctor in New Jersey, right? And this man patients are coming from all the communities, okay? He was the only doctor, for example, that took care of the African-American community in the area around Rutherford, just to give you an example. There was the Italian American community, et cetera. And the man, if a person couldn't afford the visit to the doctors, he would simply write off something, and then he'd say, "Here, take this prescription across the street and give it to this pharmacist." And the pharmacist would note the little mark at the top, and that mark meant, "Don't charge him anything. I didn't charge him anything, so you can go from there." The point is, I mean, if Flossie, his wife, used to say, "Come on, Bill, we need to eat too," you know. But this was Williams. Now, I'm not, you know, it's not that he's moving away in many ways from organized religion. There's right across the street from him, for example, is an Episcopal church right across the street, and he could hear the music every Sunday, and he put on jazz music to counter the church music going on across the street. But at the heart of it, there's this search for something deeper, and this is. And then you move to Robert Lowell. The same thing. Early on, he becomes he comes from a Boston Brahmin family, and he becomes a Catholic, and not only that, becomes a Catholic conscientious objector during World War II. He spends 6 months in Danbury prison for because of the bombings, the Allied bombings of the Ruhr Valley in Germany. And then he writes Quaker Graveyard in Nantucket. Now, he moves away from that, but he never forgets it. It comes back again late in his life. And I could go through each of them. I could go through Hart Crane, for whom the Blessed Mother is one of the two major figures in the bridge, the Ave Maria. Think about that. One of the two major figures is Mary, and she's there right from the prologue all the way through to the end. And there he is, in Mexico, and he's going to the cathedral of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And so this is something it's there. It's you can say they're, for the non-Catholics, they're plundering, the church, but they need it, just as much as Yeats needed it. Obviously, Hopkins, Wallace Stevens, here's a man throughout his life. He moves from nihilism, goes into a kind of period of silence, and then you see him moving towards, okay, what's the answer? Well, what do I look for? Is it in politics? It doesn't work for him. Okay, is it in philosophy? Well, yes, that will help. But there needs to be something more. And you see him as he follows his own mentor at Harvard, George Santayana, moving more and more towards the Catholic vision. Now, this is not something that the Stevensian critics want to hear. They don't want to hear this. You can't do this to I need this guy. Don't you dare put him into the Catholic Church, But that's where Stevens himself is moving. So they've been models for me for over 4 decades, as I myself do, write poetry and try to learn from, and I hope, learned from each of those voices. And there's so many more voices out there that I could have added. I wish I could do a biography of Flannery O'Connor. I wish I could do a biography of Langston Hughes. I mean, there's so many, but time is short. Anyway, yeah.
I'm fascinated from your presentations about the theme of suffering in the sense of psychological suffering, depression. And Elizabeth Jennings brought to my mind right away 2 other English writers that I know. We talked to Paul about this. Of course, Hopkins, the dark sonnets at the end, the Englishman in Ireland, the convert Catholic Englishmen in Ireland at the time of the great movement of nationalism toward their liberation, and Virginia Woolf. A lot of sort of, I don't know how to word it. I'm looking for the words, but of life coming out of that terrible darkness that she also experienced. So I'm curious if there's been any commentary about the relationship of these 3 English writers, poets, on this depression as suffering. I mean, the physical suffering, we heard about that in some other contexts as well. I don't know about Levertov, whether she has anything like that, but Do you find that a fruitful kind of thing to think about or comment on?
Well, I don't know of any direct connection between Jennings and Woolf, but Jennings loved Hopkins. He was her favorite. And she actually wrote an unpublished biography of Hopkins, but it's terrible. It's a terrible, and it's terrible because she also wrote one on Frost, and also that was published, and she also wrote one on Eliot. Eliot, you understand why they weren't published, because she read herself into Hopkins, and it's such an unbalanced view of the life because she just focused in on the suffering and the lack of appreciation for what he was doing. But it tells you a lot about her, and it's the same thing about why biography is necessary. You need to know she just adored Hopkins, and yet she wrote this very broken biography.
Just let me add a little bit about the Hopkins. Hopkins is so central to Robert Lowell, especially early on. I mean, in fact, I think in large, one of the reasons he converts to Catholicism is because of the poetry and the letters having come out of Hopkins. So that's very, very important to him. And the sense of suffering that you're talking about. Lowell is experiencing a deep suffering because of the war, what's going on in the war. And so you've got that. And then you have, you have John Berryman. Berryman adored Hopkins. In fact, he goes to Ireland to study Yeats, to be in the presence of Yeats's, because he had met Yeats in Yeats's last years. And in fact, at one point early on, he said, I didn't want to be like Yeats. I wanted to be Yeats, okay? But that changes. As time goes on, it becomes Father Hopkins. And it's the suffering that Hopkins experienced in Ireland in those years. That lousy Jesuit canned is the way he puts it, painfully. But that word canned is so important because it goes back to Hopkins's dark sonnets. I can do something. Choose not to be, not choose not to be. And so you can see how deep that is. And now, of my 6 biographies, 2 of them committed suicide. So I have to deal with the issue of what happens with those suicides. Hart Crane, about whom, for example, Berryman wanted to write a biography. Okay, and in fact, when Berryman waves goodbye to the students as he jumps off the bridge over the University of Minnesota into the river, he waves just like Hart Crane did. So it's there. And yet you say, Helen Vendler says, well, there it goes, he went off. No. Because earlier he says, even if I should fall from a great height, be there for me. Be there for me. So you can see, as difficult as it was for him, he's still holding out hope. Yeah.
Sure. Actually, Kevin, I just wanted to say that I'm really excited to read your book because, so I'm a composer, and there's one particular poem of Levertov's called And I Learned That Her Name Was Proverb, where she's taking from one of Merton's letters, that I set for a women's choir about 10 years ago. And the entire thing, the music is going through my mind right now. And so much of it is about the central image is a labyrinth that leads the person to a point of arrival. And I think of so much of this as related to dance, and I can't help there are so many correlations between poetry and music. And so just knowing that Levertov had this background with dance is going to really help me as now I just go back and look at more of her poems and even look more opportunities to set them. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.